Hi, dear listener, and welcome to The Loneliness Industry, a podcast where we look at loneliness as a structural and cultural issue, not as a personal failing. Here is where we decode what passes as common wisdom, the kind that actually keeps you stuck in disconnection. And if this is your first time here, I'm Jordan Rain, a philosophy graduate with a severe allergy to self-help gurus. Here I hope to make it clear why your loneliness is not a personal failing, rather a result of the system we're all embedded in. To address loneliness, we first need to trace where it comes from, and that means asking the right questions. If we're told to look in the wrong place, if we're told to endlessly tweak and fix and flog ourselves, we never get to the real source of our suffering. And someone profits from that. Very likely that someone's so-called solution contains the very values that will ensure failure, so that they can sell you yet another non-solution. So let's stop doing that. Now, this episode is the second in a 4-part series on narcissistic values in Western capitalist culture. Why would I delve into the topic of narcissism on a philosophy podcast about loneliness? The answer is narcissistic values are exactly what drives loneliness. Think about it. Hyper-individualism, the lone hero narrative, image over authenticity, control over care, and masks over openness. All of that stops us from connecting. In some cases, it can stop us from even knowing how to connect. The more people internalize these values, the more difficult it will be to combat loneliness. And yes, narcissistic values are at the root of capitalist culture, as philosopher Christopher Lasch points out in his book, The Culture of Narcissism, American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations. These same narcissistic values are at the root of disconnection. So last episode, which was episode 8, it was the first part of this series, and that's where we demonstrated how Western culture mirrors a covert narcissistic parent, rewarding you for fitting the mold, punishing you for deviating, and training you to internalize blame and strive for control rather than connection. So if you haven't heard that one, I really do recommend starting there, because this episode today builds on that foundation. So yeah, today we pick up where episode 8 left off, and we're looking at the process of becoming a self within these narcissistic systems. Be they familial or societal, we'll see that the kind of power involved pushes towards the same ends: disconnection from each other and from ourselves. But before I dive in, I want to make something very clear. Just because you were raised in a narcissistic family and shaped by a narcissistic society, it doesn't mean you became a natural narcissist. As philosophers like Lasch and psychologists like Dr. Devasula point out, narcissism is on the rise. And that is because our culture pushes those values to us. But for all the disconnection and loneliness that it leads to, the majority of us still won't actually develop NPD. Okay, it is quite likely that we'll develop some narcissistic traits. Some people will say that's unavoidable, but that is not NPD. That is not narcissistic personality disorder. That particular diagnosis is when these traits are in the extreme and plurality of them. So when Lasch talks about narcissism being on the rise, he's actually thinking in terms of values rather than actually attaining the levels of these traits of that disorder itself. Not yet, right? The fact is that the majority of us are prevented from reaching such extremes by a certain very kind of modest trait. I'm going to reveal what it is pretty soon, right? It's amusingly unglamorous, like an anti-superpower. And I hope that you will find it as refreshing and hilarious as I did. Stay tuned for the part where your foibles become what saves you. But for now, it's enough to say, on both the micro level of the covert narcissistic family and the macro level of a covert narcissistic ideology, it is not the case that everyone exposed to it transforms into a self-interested, covert control freak who gets angry at other people's joy and is prepared to see them maimed for their own needs. There are many ways in which we adapt, and many degrees to each adaptation. Now, of course, for those who do develop either a narcissistic personality disorder, which I'm going to call NPD from now on, it's a lot shorter. For those that do develop NPD or just severe narcissistic personality styles, we should keep this in mind. The system rewards narcissistic behaviour. And that's not an excuse like for harming others out of pure self-interest, because let's face it, many of us have had brutal childhoods in narcissistic systems or brutal lives in a narcissistic wider society, and we manage not to do that, okay? But even so, knowing that the system rewards narcissistic coping strategies does help us to understand why people do behave badly with increasing regularity. And it also helps us maybe forgive ourselves a little when we realise that we do have a few of these traits, right? Like obsessing over our curated social media selves, or our appearance, or our achievements, or how we do actually experience some level of schadenfreude at a competitive co-worker's misfortune. I mean, schadenfreude, I sometimes wonder if you could use that alone, like the levels of it, to gauge how narcissistic a society is. I say that living in Germany, the inventors of that word. My point is the self-focused, the ruthless, the manipulative, they succeed under the values that we've discussed in all the episodes so far: individualism, control, competition, and so on. And Christopher Lasch, he's going to come up more today, and he points out that narcissism is a survival strategy in a society or family, right, that devalues community and authenticity and promotes image over substance, performance over connection, and self-promotion over self-awareness. So it makes sense that people who've adopted these behaviours will survive. And for anyone who wants to chime in and says, oh, so becoming a narcissist is like survival of the fittest, no. Any trait that leads to total disconnection will ultimately thwart procreation and end up like some global level pub brawl over resources. Right, kind of already is. You see where this is going? Back to my point. That society rewards narcissistic traits makes sense of even more of our societal modern horrors, right? For example, that people increasingly adopt the view that other people are merely things to manipulate. It also makes sense of why people opt to perform the sort of covert power we talked about last episode in order to survive through control. But not everyone becomes a narcissist, obviously, right? Are all of your friends narcissists? No. Some of us, even when we have a narcissistic system within a narcissistic system, meaning family and society, we adapt in different ways. In both systems, even both systems at once, developing a narcissistic personality style is perhaps the most safest, well-rewarded option, but still not the only option. And for many of you listening, you'll know this, because it's not the adaptation that you're living. And that will be, in part, because of this anti-superpower that we're going to get to. So keep that fact in mind, right, as we go through the next sections, because otherwise you might end up a bit depressed or enraged, and I don't want that for you, okay? Dear listener, there is a happy-ish ending to this episode, okay? Let us recall psychology. Oh, wonderful psychology, provider of all manner of labels we can choose from for any kind of behavioural pattern out there. Psychology thinks in terms of bad apples, right? As if, the badness is inherent in the apple itself, and like the apple doesn't grow on a tree. Psychology, and particularly the DSM type psychology, forgets something that sociology doesn't forget. We're all growing on the same tree. And that tree, right now, is seriously ailing, as Christopher Lasch points out. Hypermodernised as we are, I'm pretty sure that all of us have some experience of trees. And so what do you think happens to fruit that grows on ailing trees? Well, the good news is, they're not going to all rot unless that tree is utterly fucked. But they will have various kinds of, what we're going to call adaptations. And it's unlikely that any of them will grow particularly easily. On the covert narcissistic tree that is Western culture, some apples develop narcissistic adaptations, or even full-blown NPD. They do it to survive, as we said. And others adapt differently. They might learn to make themselves small or minimise their needs. They might try to please other bigger apples, or to erase themselves and become what others need them to be. Ring any bells? Like, I actually wish it didn't, for you guys' sake. But if you're here, I'm guessing that it does. These adaptations differ from those that are classified as narcissism because they aim at connection rather than control. And this is the contrast between Alice Miller's false self and Kohut's false self that we discussed last episode. And for today, we're going to go deeper into how we adapt to the systems we're embedded in. We're going to look at how the tree will always shape us in some way or another. This is what's called the formation of the self in philosophy, meaning how the forces around us act to shape us into the people we become. With all of our protective adaptations, all our so-called issues, and the masks we learn are our best self or the most acceptable way of being. And as Judith Butler points out, albeit without botanical metaphors, the kind of tree we are on makes certain ways of being possible and others impossible. For on an apple tree, we're not going to become bananas, said Judith Butler. Not really. The big deal and the key issue is this. In covert narcissistic systems, be they familiar, societal or otherwise, we are not made who we are by personal choice, much as our ideology would have us think otherwise. We are made who we are by the kind of power exerted on us. So to start us off, I'm going to hit you with a quote from Michel Foucault. When does he not get mentioned in this podcast? The individual is not to be conceived as a sort of elementary nucleus, a primitive atom. He is already the product of power. And that's from Power and Knowledge, 1980. Now, this is Foucault saying that the self and our idea of the self, which we'd call, the ego, is shaped by what he calls power. But let's look at what he means by power first, okay? When Foucault says power, he doesn't mean like people with guns or even necessarily in uniforms or bearing official stamps. He means the institutions, ideologies and systems that form our culture and society. Now, because ideology is a key aspect of power in this framing, I'm going to give a brief definition here, okay? Ideology refers to the set of shared assumptions, values and meanings through which social realities are constructed and made to appear natural or inevitable. Now, I'm going to repeat this because you're probably listening on a podcast or on YouTube or whatever, and you might not have your hands free. This is an important definition. Ideology refers to the set of shared assumptions, values and meanings through which social realities are constructed and made to appear natural or inevitable. So it turns out that ideology is not just one of those cool new words I learned in my first year at uni thing that like Rick Mail and the young ones might bark at passers-by to try and be cool. Well, it is that, right? It is that too, but it's a seriously important concept. It involves values and how those values are made to appear natural and inevitable. So, important recap on some of the values that are part of Western capitalist culture. In other words, that are part of our ideology. We have individualism, the lone hero narrative, control, competition, and emotional repression in favour of rationality. Now let's look at some of the mechanisms used to ensure those values are made to appear natural and inevitable. We talked about these mechanisms last week. Very important, right? So do go back and listen to that episode. Otherwise, this might sound a bit random. The tactics used to push Western capitalist values are the same ones as those used in covert narcissistic families. They include things like blame shifting. The blame is always shifted onto the individual. Manipulation, like into thinking we need or want things that we actually do not. Exclusion, that is like rejecting those seen as varying, too far from norms. I mean, that starts in schools. And finally, though this is not an exhaustive list, right? Go back to next week. But finally, importantly, gaslighting, which is causing you to question your experience or reality. And as mentioned last week, these are all typical tactics for covert control. That is, for exercising covert power. Interruption. This is the obligatory call to please like, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell. That's how you get informed about new episodes dropping. And if you want to support the podcast, please do share it on social media. That's a brilliant way to support us. Just like and share. It doesn't cost you anything, and it really, really helps with the algorithm and all that stuff. Now, if you do want to support me financially on Patreon or YouTube, that would be absolutely fantastic. On YouTube, you can do it by clicking join. And you can also donate via the website. Just head to www.thelonelinessindustry.net. And thank you so much. On with the podcast. Back to the values that are pushed with these mechanisms, though. The values of control and individualism offer quite a good illustration of how ideology works. So here we go. This section, if you're not watching on YouTube, is called Western Culture's Big We Are Free advertising campaign. Because Western culture puts a ton of effort into convincing us that we chose to be as we are, that we have freedom of choice and therefore control over outcomes. We're trained to believe that we're the hero of our own story. I think that's episode 3, so go back if you're unsure on that one. We're taught to believe we're the central character who shapes everything ourselves, an individual in control. But, let's be real. Let's think about something as simple as shopping for clothes. You might believe that you're choosing what you wear based on your personal style and individuality. But in reality, your choices are heavily influenced by trends, advertising, And the message that you should wear certain things to look successful or attractive or to fit in, be that fitting in at work or into a subculture. Society subtly tells you what's in and what's out, what works for this, what doesn't work for this. And like here in Germany, we even have, what's acceptable and what is not is pretty strongly pushed because they really hold conformity dear. However, conformity here has to also be dressed up as choosing, as like opting. I would choose to conform, even, I have all of the choices in the world, but I will conform my choice. So, coming from a far more expressive culture in terms of clothing, these things became a lot more noticeable to me. It's like if you go into a shop and all there is tan, you'd notice too. But the point is, even your choice of clothing is shaped by external factors. You might think you're being an individual, or you might think you're choosing to conform, but you're still following a script set by a larger cultural and economic force. And often, in a very Butlerian way, because other scripts have been made unavailable, such as, that thing we mentioned in another episode where you go into a baby shop and there's only blue or pink. Other options have been made unavailable. Conform to the gender norm. Anyway, this next part, it can make people angry sometimes, right? Because our belief in total freedom and control is actually the result of ideology. Remember that ideology in action is ideology being invisible. It's not about making us consciously aware of what's happening. It's the illusion of choice that keeps us in line. Now, Western capitalism spends a lot of effort making it look like we're not shaped by its systems, ideology, and institutions. It uses tactics like advertising, social pressure, and these are forms of manipulation, by the way, that fit into covert narcissistic control. But it even utilizes self-help culture to make we think we have freedom of choice, because that perpetuates what capitalism needs: production, profit, and consumerism. The very fact that we believe we are in control of ourselves and our lives, that we're choosing the outcomes, that's evidence that the system is working. The illusion of autonomy keeps the wheels of capitalism turning. And that's what really hits when you realise that you haven't been fully free in your choices. It can feel like the ground beneath you has dropped away because it challenges everything you thought you knew about yourself. So, this isn't a criticism of you or me or anyone else, because we're all subject to it. We live in a society where ideology is invisible, and it works by shaping our perceptions without us even realising it. And here's an example I hope will make it even clearer. I talked last episode about this, right? I made a choice at the age of 10 that felt like my own personal revelation. It felt like, oh man, I have solved this. Me personally, I have solved this. I've found this thing that's going to change my life. I decided to stop eating, right? I thought that if I just lost weight, I could solve all my problems. I thought it would stop Bertha from hating me and it would end the bullying at school. And obviously the former didn't quite work, but the latter did. And in my young mind, I was in control. I thought I was the boss, making my own clever choice and asserting my own power. And I remember the feeling of it to this day. It's like, I've got it. I've solved it. Personally, this was my choice. What I didn't know, what kid does at that age, is that my decision was really shaped by the values of the society I lived in. The notion that my worth, my value, could be tied to my physical appearance or how thin or attractive I appeared. That was an ideology that had been inscribed on me from an early age. It was a societal script that I was unknowingly following, not realising that this choice that I made was influenced by forces far beyond the tiny town in rural New Zealand where I lived. I would never have imagined at the age of 10 I was subject to culture, capitalism and ideology, right? The weight loss, the body control. It wasn't just some closed system issue between me and my schoolmates or me and Bertha, right? Even that was all driven by the ideological message that they had swallowed, that I had swallowed. Those in female bodies need to meet a certain standard of beauty to be acceptable, valuable, or even worthy of attention. So what felt like, and it really did feel like, autonomy was just the illusion of freedom. It wasn't about me asserting my independence or rejecting societal pressures. It was about me internalizing them so deeply that I thought they were my own desires. And that's what Foucault was talking about, how we're shaped by invisible ideologies and yet think we're making the choices. The power behind this isn't about overt control or direct coercion. It's about the quiet, pervasive force of cultural norms and values, shaping our sense of self without us even knowing. That is covert control, and that is what we talked about in the last episode. And what I want to say is, feeling betrayed when you hear that for the first time, that's normal. I felt that way too. It's one of those crux moments when you can either keep swallowing the blue pill feverishly or start accepting the very bitter red one. And if you're still with me, you've chosen the red one. I really respect that. It can be very painful, illustrating what ideology is, and the fact that we aren't immune. The fact that it makes its values seem so natural and correct means that learning we are not in control, it seems inconceivable. It makes us feel powerless, with good reason. The power is somewhere else, in ideology, and the institutions and systems that uphold it and that act on us. That is what Foucault is talking about. Now, thinkers like Marx go further and actually put the power aspect into their definitions of ideology. Marx would define ideology itself more like, ideology is a set of ideas and beliefs that serve to legitimize and uphold the interests of the ruling class by masking the true nature of social and economic relations. So that definition, that already points to the mechanisms involved and the fact that they're covert. In other words, they cover up what's really going on. Now here's the sad part. Was that sad enough for anyone? Foucault and Marx are clear in that they don't just say some of us are formed by power, right? They say we all are. And this includes, anyone that actually has some sort of aspect of power. Because really these things are kind of an emergent system that, we feed into, and, it pre-exists us, we feed into it. It's society is bigger than all of us. And they say no one is immune. We are all formed by power. But, right, this, just in case you're worrying, this does not cancel out the saving grace that I mentioned earlier, okay? So bear with me, that one's coming. Western culture trains us to think we are fully autonomous. So a lot of people really think along the lines of, society is out there and, I can ignore it if I want. But thinkers like Bourdieu, Foucault, Butler, and even Taoists have all, in different ways, shown how society lives in us. It's not actually that radical suggestion. Society pre-exists us. We're born into it. The adults who raise you were already shaped by the ideology, institutions, and systems they grew up in. And you needed them around. They brought you up within that set of institutions, ideologies, and systems. And even so, a lot of us think we're immune to these values, right? Now, I worked briefly as an escort to fund my philosophy degree. And every single man I accompanied to anything said he just happened to like thin women, right? And they seriously believed that their taste was 100% their own and not formed by the fashion of the time, which was, Kate Moss type bodies. And, I'm sure that the generation brought up with, the whole massive ass ideal, they likely think that they just inherently like massive asses. And, what this really illustrates is Marx's point about ideology. It operates invisibly, hiding the very fact of its operation. Now, if a culture reifies the individual as being in the driver's seat of everything, that same culture is going to say you can ignore, transcend, or defy any and every influence if you so choose, including society itself. But we're not free-floating individuals. We're shaped by the tree that we're on and the soil it grows in. If that soil is poisoned, if that tree is ailing, we can't just look at a couple of bad fruit and go, the rest will be completely fine. And we mentioned that last episode, right? But what we're going to go into now is the how of society coming to dwell within us. How ideology comes to implant itself into your selfhood. How the values out there in the world get to be in here, in the selves that we become. And I'll be highlighting how this parallels power in covert narcissistic families as we go. I'm framing this by mentioning Christopher Lasch again and his book, The Culture of Narcissism, American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations, because he makes the point that Western capitalism's actual values are narcissistic. So when we're dealing with how power plants values into us as selves, Lasch would remind us that those values being implanted are narcissistic ones. And I'm adding my own argument from last episode that the mechanisms of that power mirror covert narcissism. Now into Althusser. Yes, a man of controversies that I do not have time to go into. Althusser talks about how we're shaped by what he calls interpellation. Now, not interpretation, interpellation. This is a process whereby we as selves are hailed by society into certain roles and modes of being. Now, the classic example when you're dealing with Althusser is the policeman thing. So you're walking along, maybe innocently, maybe with a bunch of weed in your pocket or a stolen cabbage, who knows, and you hear a policeman yell out, "Hey, you." So instantly, you are aware of yourself as a subject of the law. You might politely answer, or you might actually run away, but you are, in that moment of being hailed, "Hey, you," a person whose personhood is framed by the law, either as obeying it or not obeying it. And you know this in the example. You also see yourself in that way, in that moment, just as the policeman does. You wouldn't run away if you weren't considering yourself under the law, right? You run away because you're like, Jesus, I'm in trouble. Society has hailed you into the role of a subject under law. And you don't have a choice there, right? Having grown up in that system, you will see yourself in those terms. The hailing just brings it into full view, making, it a more clear reality. Now, in narcissistic family systems, as those of you who are unfortunate enough to be in them too, you might know that children are hailed into roles too. You have the golden child or the scapegoat, the lost child and so on. The roles are not chosen by the child. They are imposed by the governing power, a parent. So growing up in that system, you're called to see yourself in that way as well. Like, as my example is the scapegoat child, right? Because that's the role I had. So when my name was called, and you guys who've been in these systems, you know the tone. It's like, Jordan! That tone, and it drags you immediately into that role. The role of she who is to blame for spoiled dinner, siblings crying, a solar flare, a moon landing failing, whatever. You are the scapegoats, know the story. It is you being hailed into the role of problematic person, and you start to see yourself that way as well. Similarly, the golden child will be hailed into thinking of themselves as a spectacular person, and they'll believe it too, quite often. So the parallel, in capitalist society, it hails us into roles as well. Whether it's as, like a patient, when you get some diagnosis, you're hailed into the role of a patient. You'll be hailed into the role as kinds of worker, competitors, and hailed into the role of your gender. And just like in the narcissistic family, we come to internalize these roles, believing them to be natural, inherent parts of ourselves. And I think being a woman here is a good example too, because, having tits, I'm often hailed into the role of being a woman, with all the expectations that go with that, right? Like, I will know how to hold a complete stranger's baby, or be prepared to listen to a boring monologue from a person without tits who imagines that they're interesting. This is exactly how capitalism operates, right? It teaches us to internalize the roles that keep the system in place, making us believe that our worth is defined by how well we perform those roles. And if my worth was really defined by how well I perform the woman role, I'm a shitty woman, right? Being non-binary, I'm a pretty shitty woman. I suck at listening to boring monologues, and I repeatedly drop children on their heads. And if I really did consider myself a woman, I'd have to conclude that I suck. But here is the other pain in the ass about ideology. Society doesn't give a rat's ass about the fact that I don't consider myself a woman, right? And most people don't either. I'll still get judged as such. And that's kind of the point, right? The roles are predefined based on society's values, not mine. So most people will experience me from within the framing of woman, even if I don't. Because it's training, right? It's insanely hard to break. Human heads break more easily. So never hand me your child. Anyway, moving on to Foucault before there are any more casualties. As we mentioned last episode, Foucault takes us further with the idea of disciplinary power. Foucault explains that power is not just about authority or control. It's about how we internalize control and self-regulate to the point that it feels like it's actually our own choices. This is the panopticon effect, right, which we've discussed several times, both with and without pictures. But in case it's your first time, okay, a brief summary. If you have heard this all before, skip forward about maybe, 30 seconds. The panopticon, originally designed by Jeremy Bentham, is a prison where inmates are constantly aware of the possibility of being watched by a guard that they can't see, but who can, at least potentially, always see them. Now, the uncertainty, right, about whether you're being monitored or not, this is what leads them to regulate their own behaviour. No guard required in the end. Foucault used this idea to explain how society works, how we internalise norms and values and begin to self-monitor and self-discipline without needing external control. Now, hopefully you can see the parallels there to covert narcissism and families, and go back to next week if you can't. But it does go a step further too, because part of that self-monitoring involves telling ourselves that the standards we are trying to hold are actually our own. This is gaslighting in action. It's self-gaslighting, but it's gaslighting. Society doesn't have to gaslight us necessarily. We learn to even use the mechanisms on ourselves. Anyway, this internalization of regulatory power makes us believe that we're making the choices freely. But in reality, we're just following the hidden structures of power, whether it's the parent or the larger capitalist system. Butler offers a brilliant crystallization of all this. Butler points out that this amounts to the fact that the self is not owned. The self is formed in relation to power and recognition. Also not nice to hear, right? That our very self, is something that we do not own. That idea is just scary and kind of beyond comprehension, thanks to how our ideology operates, right? Invisibly, and that we're in control. But this idea is also the clincher, because it makes clear how Western culture mirrors covert narcissistic family systems. Our self is not owned by us in those systems. It is shaped by those in power, and whether or not those in power offer recognition or reward. Now, as mentioned before, right, we are rewarded for doing what is held up as ideal. This includes things like being the ideal woman, the ideal man, the ideal worker, or, pertaining to narcissism, the ideal, ruthless, self-interested fuck. Because, studies have shown they make great CEOs somehow. The mechanism in this, it's gaslighting and blame shifting both at once. As our failure to measure up becomes something we really see as us failing to meet our own standards. And back to the recognition thing in Butler, in a narcissistic family, the child is constantly seeking recognition, either by gaining approval from the narcissistic parent or by fulfilling the role that the parents assigned them. Now, I wish none of you had experienced this firsthand, but I know a lot of you did. And to spell it out for those of you who didn't, you will live in society. In these systems, in these family systems, some of us were rewarded by one parent only when we vanished, because ideally for them, we would never have been born. You might also have been rewarded by another parent for getting good grades, right? Because ideally you would reflect what they consider their own brilliance. It is all a reward for adhering to the role you've been assigned. Now, in Western capitalist society, recognition plays out in the same way. Our worth is determined by how well we meet external expectations, things like status, wealth, beauty, success. And this is why we should remember that people don't necessarily choose narcissistic traits for pleasure or something, right? They're incentivized. So all this to kind of illustrate how the self emerges in the system. The self that emerges is not an authentic one. It is a self built on the need for validation and external recognition, whether consciously or not. And in a nutshell, whether you ended up with narcissistic adaptations or other ones that are just as painful, you didn't actually choose to become the version of you that you are. You were recruited. And survival meant saying yes to the call to being hailed. Now, in case you're still worried that, all of this makes you a narcissist, of necessity, don't worry. The good news is up in a minute. But, just before we get to it, this section is called The Emergence of the Self, or the call to become who you are not. You might recognise that kind of idea as coming from Heidegger. Now, I really loved that idea as well from Heidegger, becoming who you are, become who you are. You might have heard it before. It appeals because it sounds like this call to blossom into the person that we somehow always were at our core from the beginning. It sounds like a call to nurture and tend to something that is beautifully, truly authentic and ours. And it sounds beautiful partly because it appeals to a culture that says, it's all about me. Me, I'm beautiful. My inner world, I. This is not the thing that I'm offering as solace, right? Because this idea is what Foucault is actually railing against. The idea that we are here to become ourselves, poetic as it sounds, assumes there is some core to us. It assumes there's some sort of nascent character that just could become more so as we move through life. And as we've seen, Foucault says there is no such core. And instead of some internal call from you to become who you are, there is the call of ideology. Now, I mean, we love calls from us to us, also because of the whole individualism thing, right? The call of ideology, that sounds horrible in comparison. And it sounding horrible makes perfect sense as well, given our values. We want to be in control and be able to believe that we are. And I mean, it is kind of just as horrible as it sounds, because the call, not from within but from without, is a call to be a certain kind of self, one that fits with ideology, one that perpetuates it. Our selves get pruned and cut back when they don't perform the thing they're meant to. If our selves don't conform to norms and expectations and condoned ways of being in the world. And as Lash points out, under Western capitalist culture, which is to say, under covert narcissistic power, we are called to be a self that is not about authentic connection. Instead, a self that embodies narcissistic values. We are called to be a self that psychology would call a false self. A self that is all about image. A self that is all about control, because that is what is required to survive within the values of the system. Which makes it sound like we're fucking doomed, doesn't it? So seriously, it's high time for the bit of good news that I've been promising all of this time. The first sigh of relief that you might get, because it means that you do have a certain kind of out. It's a small one, right? More like a sidestep than an out, being totally honest. But it can be the difference between total capitulation to all this and not. So it can be the difference between developing what gets labelled NPD and not. So it is actually a big enough deal. And, part of the reason I don't want to overhype these things is because, it would really appeal to the hero narrative if I said, you have a superpower. It's not a superpower, this thing. So, the crux part. Why you probably, most likely, did not become a narcissist. Turns out that we as human beings are imperfect. No shit, you say. Why is that even relevant? Because for one thing, it's very obviously true, right? I don't think I need to spend 20 minutes backing that up. 2, because the fact of our imperfection means we're not perfect in internalizing what society and its various institutions and power structures tell us to. Our imperfection can be the very thing that stops us from becoming incapable of connection, as those with full-blown NPD are. So let's expand on what is probably the opposite of what most teachers of anything will tell you. The fact that you, me, and the vast majority of people are shit at something is our saving grace. So may it really hit home this time when I say, embrace your imperfections. Now, this is a kind of an oversimplification of something that comes from Althusser's work, by the way. Okay, so dodgy as he was on many levels, Althusser makes it clear that there is always this gap between what society asks of us and how we fully actually manage to take that in. He argues that our imperfections, right, our failure to fully internalize the demands of society, can actually be a form of subtle resistance. Subtle resistance. So this is not, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me. This is, oh yeah, I really would do what you tell me, but I'm just kind of crap at things. So in his view, ideology, right, the shared beliefs and values and ideas that make up culture and society, it's not just something that we absorb perfectly. It's something we do internalize, but imperfectly, due to what he calls, he calls them our natural contradictions. And you might have to think about this for a while, because, we are in a culture where we strive for consistency, and I know I certainly do. But it's just another of these mirages of perfection that we create, to appear good enough. And, personally, I've realised I'm a walking sack of contradictions. And because I'm not that unusual, I'm a human being, it's likely to be typically human. So now I'm going to share some of them just in the name of not pretending to be perfect. And, if you feel like sharing yours too in the comments, I will consider you brave, really. So number one, I rail against diet culture. I mean, I fucking hate diet culture. It's one of the most toxic things in the world. And yet I will say no to fish and chips. And I love fish and chips. But I'm worried that I'll put on weight. Contradiction, right? I hate, as you guys know this, I hate being interpreted as a woman. Right? I like to remain unclassifiable and remind myself and others not to put people in boxes. But here, look at me putting in fuck all effort most of the time to dress in a way that might make me more unclassifiable. Contradiction. The point is, our propensity for natural contradictions means we aren't fully absorbed into the system. That gap between what is demanded of us and what we're capable of getting right is resistance via glorious fallibility. And, that fallibility, it's what allows space for empathy and for connection. So, say yay to our incompetence and our lack of consistency, really. Now, all of that might have just sounded like amusing examples. So to illustrate exactly the point of this podcast, as you know from last episode, I grew up in a not one, but two narcissistic personality disorder household. If I was a more competent person, it is likely that by now I would be a massive asshole, right? I would. So thanks to our glorious ability to fuck things up, some of us can't shut off empathy. Yeah, that seriously disadvantageous knowledge that others actually have feelings too, and that they are sometimes deeply affected by our actions. That thing, empathy, that is really a deciding factor in whether or not we do develop NPD, or even psychopathy. Now, speaking of empathy, someone actually did comment on it after one of the other episodes, I can't remember which one, and what they said is actually a really good example of how value systems operate to perpetuate themselves in our culture. So I'm going to share this. Now, I'm going to call this person Sven for anonymity because I don't actually have anything against them, and you'll see why in a second, but you might sort of not really like what they say, as I didn't. Sven commented that empathy was a result of childhood trauma. Now, Sven did not specify, there's different kinds of empathy, right? But Sven just said blanket, empathy is a result of childhood trauma. In other words, Sven wanted to pathologize empathy. Now, I'm fairly sure that Sven, is a smart guy and believed that his comment sounded, clever and risque. And maybe it does. But here's the thing. Sven was doing exactly what one would expect in someone who has internalized the values we are meant to internalize under Western capitalist culture. He was protecting those values he had internalized. And, this is something I talked about in episode 6, how we label what is opposite to our ideals sick or wrong. So Sven was labeling empathy sick and wrong, right? Now, given that rationality is valued and emotions are devalued, and that needing others is seen as weak in, like, narcissistic, read Western cultures, it is not surprising or new that Sven had come to see empathy as pathological. Sven had simply internalized the system somewhat more competently than others of us do. Now, I'm not saying Sven's a narcissist there. You can internalize it to various levels of perfection or terrible imperfection. But Sven helped me see where the system leads, and this underscores what Christopher Lasch says, right? The system leads to a total pathologization of exactly the thing that is vital to holding us together. So here we see exactly the link between narcissistic values and the eruption of loneliness in society. But, I don't want to digress too far. So, for those of us who are a bit less competent than Sven, you probably feel on some visceral level that, being the lone wolf hero in control and rational at all times and consistently non-empathetic, it feels unfulfilling. So instead, you and I are searching for connection. And that, dear listener, is why what Althusa is talking about is really great. This beautiful saving incompetence in a system that reifies individualism and the hero narrative and condemns emotion and empathy. We're still here talking about loneliness and how to connect because we didn't get it right in terms of what's being demanded of us. So, good news. And there's more good news, actually. Well, it's good enough news incoming as well. But first we have to revisit something we mentioned last week, which psychology calls false selves. Because those are still what covert narcissistic systems, be they family or society or both, false selves are still what they produce and demand. And yeah, the title of this, if you're not watching on YouTube, is a bit of a spoiler. The falsehood of false selves. As we've established, not everyone exposed to narcissistic systems becomes a narcissist. By now that should hopefully be a non-brainer. But as Foucault and Marx would argue, none of us can really emerge as any kind of true self. Foucault even suggests that the whole concept of a true self is a myth. Now, just to remind you of the quote, the individual is not to be conceived as a sort of elementary nucleus, a primitive atom. He is already a product of power. And perversely, therein lies the solace. If we can't even be a true self, like under any system, be it narcissistic or lovely, why even worry about having a false self? And to answer that, we're going to have to actually take a bit of a deeper look at what I mean by false selves, what psychology means by false selves. And obviously, I'm going to argue that the main problem is not false selves per se, because, they're inevitable. The problem is when they disconnect us from each other. So, this is about loneliness after all. And talking about narcissism leading to loneliness, and saying, narcissists have a false self, and, there are other kinds of false selves, we're also damaged. This is actually the crux point. So, the concept of the false self was introduced by psychologists like Kohut, Winnicott, and Miller. And for them, the false self arises when narcissistic systems, be they familial or societal, shape us into the roles that they need us to play to, such a huge extent that, we forget that we are not those roles. So it's often described as a mask, like a version of ourselves that we present to the world in response to external pressures. But given what Foucault says about there not being a true self anyway, it's probably more accurate to call them modes of being, right? But I am going to stick to masks and false selves for the sake of clarity, so that you know that I'm talking about their ideas. And as we talked about last week, the kinds of selves that are, formed by power, they can have different motivations depending on the individual. Miller's version, the one from the drama of the gifted child, is a false self that seeks connection, like driven by a desire to be seen and validated and loved. So, given that it's seeking connection, we're going to bracket why that kind of false self is deemed problematic for a second. Kohut's false self is more aligned with what we associate with narcissistic personality disorder. It seeks to control. In that extreme case, for Kohut, the mask isn't just a survival mechanism, it becomes a way of life. This false self becomes a protective armour to hide vulnerability and maintain an image of superiority. Now, psychology argues that those with NPD are not even aware that they're wearing a mask, right? They mistake the false self for the real self. They believe that the false persona they've created is their real self. And, you can see the problem here, right? If no real self is possible, the false self, why is it not the real self? Anyway, meanwhile, Miller's version of the false self is generally considered more self-aware, recognising that the mask is a performance that's, something to fulfil external expectations, but with this sort of underlying yearning for real, authentic connection. Psychology states that both versions of the false self share the same fundamental problem, and that is alienation from the true self. That is, disconnection from the, real core that Foucault says we don't have, and which is deemed to be the root of disconnection to others. So, having a false self means not having the so-called real self, like it's havable, and that having a false self is the reason for our disconnection to others. Here's where psychology's own approach is problematic. It seems to hinge on whether we know that we're wearing a mask or not. Here's the thing. In both narcissistic family systems and capitalist society, we're still all expected to play roles, whether that's the golden child or the scapegoat or the dutiful worker or the ideal consumer or the good father or the law-abiding citizen or whatever. And if you're going to hang it on a lack of knowledge about the fact that this is what we do, I know people who certainly do not have narcissistic personality disorder, but they are nonetheless completely unaware that we are shaped in ways that push us to wear masks or to act out roles that we may not otherwise want to act out at all, right? Now, and if you kick around in the blog space, the podcast space, and so on narcissism, you too will have discovered there are some people with narcissistic personality disorder who are aware of what's going on with them. Given that none of us can develop a true self, the true self is a myth, right? The false self itself can't be the problem. The problem psychology could erect is that we're not aware of it. But we have people with NPD who are aware of it, and we have people without NPD who are totally not aware of it. So that doesn't make any sense either. The point is, to put it in Foucauldian terms, somewhat, the shaping of the self is not some rare pathological event. It is something that happens to everyone. This adaptation to the system, this formation of the so-called false self, it's a universal process that all of us go through, whether we recognise it or not. And if all of us are shaped, and if all of us are pruned and end up adapting ourselves, the idea of the false self, it loses its meaning, because it's actually the norm. And people with NPD are not the only ones who are unaware of it. Like I said, many of us are unaware of it. God, how many decades was I unaware of it? The real issue happens when it leads to disconnection. As Miller's false self shows us, those who frame their actions solely based on what others want from them, now they experience this deep longing for the kind of connection where they are seen as well, right? That is the crux of the issue. When those masks, those so-called false selves, go far enough that half of us are completely blinded to the other because, we're completely self-obsessed and narcissistic, and the other half pays no attention to themselves whatsoever, only just sort of, what do you need from me? What do you need from me? There is no intimacy. There is no seeing into each other. There's one sort of desperately looking into one and the other just going, ugh. There's no connection there. This is one-way sight, right? This is not seeing into one another. It's just a one-way seeing. That is not connection. So yeah, don't be worrying about whether or not you've developed a false self. You have. We all have. Worry instead about whether you're dealing with, every other false self out there. Are they capable of seeing into you? Are you capable of seeing into them? Is there that curiosity? Often no, because some of these things are extreme. There's the worry. Some of these things are so extreme that we're just entirely fixated on the other person or entirely closed off in ourselves. So this section is called, If You Can't Be a Good Example, Be a Terrifying Warning. What this means is that NPD and false selves, as defined by psychology, should not serve as a commentary on whether or not you are your true self or not, right? Let's drop this talk about false selves. What NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, should serve as is a warning. We miss the lesson in NPD if we see it only as pathology. Just like we can miss the lesson in stuff like, war and hate crimes if we don't recognise the fact that we too are capable of all that bad shit, right? If we don't recognise our own propensity to act in such ways, like, our own propensity to develop our masks to such an extent that we forget how to see others. And I say our in quotes, because this doesn't come from us, but from, the great emergent property of humanity's clustering together over time that we call society. Even though we're not all narcissists, we do all live in a society that pushes us towards that same kind of performance. Ideology permeates us all, and that ideology in itself is narcissistic. Capitalism socializes all of us into roles. We become workers, consumers, genders, competitors, the ideal, whatever. These roles aren't something we freely choose. And I remind you of Butler here. Certain roles are just not even allowed. Take any queer gender, for example. So these roles are something we must take on in order to function within society. If we don't, we risk becoming invisible, irrelevant, or seen as broken. And this is the lesson. If we do what those with NPD are said to be doing, meaning, internalize societal values too efficiently, we risk becoming consumed by the roles that we perform. We risk blindness to a way of being that inherently alienates us from our ability to connect. Those with NPD are deemed unable to connect authentically because their identity is entirely wrapped up in the image they project. They are entirely possessed with the curation of their self. They can't let down the mask because they fear it is the only thing keeping them afloat. And this intense performance, it creates deep emotional isolation for them and anyone around them. So in short, a key aspect of the solution to loneliness is recognizing the extent to which we are playing roles. When we see that we are encouraged to form an identity based around a mask, and all of us are, that awareness can mean our mask becomes just that, something that we can drop when it's needed. And that is resistance in itself. Falling into roles and condoned ways of being might be inevitable, at least in our time, but knowing how it happens means those things won't completely define us. When we are aware that this stuff is just part of what we present to the world, we can then start to look beneath the tip of the iceberg, our own iceberg and everybody else's. Right? And I say this because feeling empty, unworthy, and desperate for validation is by no means exclusive to those with NPD. In fact, given what has been said today, it would be kind of weird if someone didn't feel any of that stuff, at least sometimes, in this system that we're growing up in. Growing up in a narcissistic system makes those kinds of feeling almost unavoidable. And remember what Lash said, wider society is a narcissistic system. So, resistance. This section is resistance, seeing the system inside the self. Psychology often labels us broken when we don't meet some idealized version of who we're supposed to be. We're told there's this true self that we're supposed to uncover, but that true self is a myth. We don't just become who we are in some abstract, romanticized way, unaffected by anything around us. We become who we need to be. We adapt, imperfectly, to survive in systems that pressure us to fit into roles that don't allow for true connection. These roles, whether in narcissistic families or capitalist societies, they're not things we choose freely. They're imposed on us. Society demands we become at least one of those things. Workers, consumers, ideal men and women, and so on. These roles limit us, they damage us, and they disconnect us from our deeper selves and from the deeper selves of others. But here's the transformative part. Once we recognise that we've been shaped by these systems, we can begin to question the masks we wear. We can stop wearing them as our identity and start seeing them for what they are, survival mechanisms. And this awareness is what opens the door to real connection. Because when we let go of the role society forced on us, we can finally begin to define ourselves differently. We can finally become the people that we at least believe we really are. At least we can break out of the mold. The beauty in this recognition is that our imperfections are what give us the space to connect. Our failure to perfectly internalize societal ideals is the very thing that frees us. We're not fully molded into the roles we're assigned, and that's a good thing because it means we're not trapped. The system doesn't have the last word. We're part of the system and it's a part of us. It doesn't have the last word. We still have the power to break free, even if it's only in small ways. And here's where it gets tricky. Society and psychology gaslight us into thinking that we are the problem. We're told that if we don't fit these molds, there's something wrong with us. But the real problem is that the system is demanding we conform. The false self is not pathological, it's adaptive. It's how we survive in the world that leaves no room for authenticity. The danger arises when we internalize demands too perfectly, especially the demand to be completely independent, to shut off our empathy and not interest ourselves in other people's being. That is the warning of narcissistic personality disorder. If we lose ourselves completely in performance, we risk emotional isolation, but we don't have to fall into that trap. So while we all wear masks, it is not because we're broken, it is because we're forced to. And the more we recognise these masks for what they are, the closer we get to some sort of meaningful connection with ourselves and with others. Finally, the other warning. Much as NPD teaches us a very useful lesson, let it be taught from afar. As you've seen and heard from my own experiences in narcissistic families, and doubtless seen on other channels or unfortunately experienced yourself, those with a disorder are those who cannot and will not be able to offer you the connection you seek. They may become self-aware, and really there's no hope until that happens. They may become self-aware, yes, and all my respect to them when they do. But until they do, and for many years of work after that, unfortunately, all they'll be capable of is perpetuating your disconnection if you're anywhere near them. So leave. And I'm taking a stand on that. Leave. For support on that, check out Dr. Ramani or any of the, I'm going to post some podcasts in the notes on this. And if you want some insights from, those who actually are self-aware, there's a couple, Ben Taylor and Lee Hammock, I'll put them in the notes as well. It's actually very good to pick their brains about things. It's fascinating, but yeah, do leave. Do leave. And on that note, I will see you next time with an episode on, the God complex and the self-help industry. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Please like, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell. That's how you actually get notifications about new episodes. And if you want to support the podcast, please share it on social media. That is a really good, helpful thing. It doesn't cost you anything. Just share it. That would be super, super helpful. Thanks for listening. See you then.